Hi Juliet, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, Kim. How are you?
Yes, yeah, very well, thank you. So Juliet, you're one of the partners at Law 365 in the commercial team,
Yeah.
and obviously you help support loads of our clients. Um, Obviously, there's been a lot of talk around DORA,
hmm
and it has been affecting our clients. Can you just tell us a little bit about what is DORA, please?
Okay. So DORA is the Digital Operational Resilience Act. It's an EU act and it came into, well, it was applicable from January this year. So it's a piece of EU legislation which is comprehensive set of obligations for financial entities to strengthen their cyber resilience. It's all kinds of financial institutions, so it's not just banks, credit
Mhm.
institutions, investment firms, crowdfunding service providers even, but also impacts ICT third-party service providers.
Right.
So,
And how does it sort of impact them in what way does it impact them?
well, so where it comes from, this act is it's from the sort of the realization that the financial and so many obviously other businesses, but the financial sector has got such a big reliance on ICT providers. So that's kind of why it's come into force, and it sits alongside various other security pieces of legislation and GDPR and all the rest of it. And it doesn't it sits with it. It doesn't replace anything else. So it's kind of another layer.
Mm.
Um, but it will impact the ICT service providers. So at one level, it's those that are providing a critical service.
Right.
So the critical service providers, one would probably think of the larger service providers, you like Microsoft, Google,
Yeah.
AWS, and all the rest of it, the big cloud service providers, and they probably will be critical service providers, but there's a test that will be conducted. It'll be carried out by a lead regulatory body to determine where an entity is a critical service provider. And
Mm.
there's a two-step process to determine this. And first of all, it's quantitative. So it's about how much of the service provider's customers make up 10%. It's a 10% number of at least one of the categories of the financial entities. So
Right.
if they're providing it to a significant proportion, then they will pass the quantitative step. And then the qualitative step, they'll be digging into the detail of the degree of sort of substitutability of the service that's being provided, and the character and the impact that the third party service provider has on that business. So it's it has the impact on those larger ones we can sort of see immediately, but also on smaller businesses, because particularly if they've got a niche offering, they may be providing to 10%, so they may fall under that category. And that means that more of the requirements of the legislation will apply to them. For other kind of ICT service providers where perhaps they're, reselling software and just providing support services, although it will impact them, it won't impact them to the same extent. They need to be clear that they are not responsible for that third party
Yeah.
provision of service, and where they are providing services that might fall within DORA, there is an element of proportionality that is
Mhm.
referred to within the Act. So that your compliance with the Act is proportionate to the service you're providing, the size of your business, and the risk that it poses to the financial entity. Unfortunately, like all of these things, when it has first come out, we don't actually know exactly what that means. But it's important that those businesses aren't signing up to more obligations than
Mm.
under a contract than they would be required to under the Act.
Mhm. And is there anything, so from a contract basis, is there anything that they need to be sharp to in terms of what they need to add in their contracts or support that obligation?
I mean, I think what they need to be clear about is that they're not responsible for those third party service providers. So where they are, the Microsofts and all the rest of it, they need to be clear that that's not they can't be responsible for their
Yeah.
compliance. But I think it's more about, so I think there'll be more requested to demonstrate their because there's lots of requirements, due diligence requirements for your suppliers or or your sub processors,
Yeah.
transparency for how you're onboarding those businesses, those partners, and there's also additional requirements for third-party penetration testing
Right. Okay.
and the provision of that. So it sort of depends what service you're providing, but those are sorts of things that in the supply chain you might have to be providing. So I think more, not so much necessarily putting that in the contract, but kind of being aware that that's the sort of,
Yeah.
that's more of the obligations that you might have to comply with.
Mhm.
And so make sure that you've got things in place so that you can do that.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And DORA is obviously an EU act. The UK is no longer in the EU. So what does that actually mean for UK businesses?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it, it still applies because the Act applies to all of those financial institutions have an EU presence. So, so if they're in the EU, and obviously most of the, well, all the banks, they will be, and most of them will be offering services through Europe. So it is likely to apply, and therefore impact. And then it might be the UK government's probably is considering its response and whether, to what extent it's going to enact it sort of directly. So, we'll obviously wait and see what happens there. But yes, unfortunately, it's not something we can just say, oh, nothing to do with us.
Yeah, it still can't get your head in the sand for that. You have to sort of
No.
understand that it could still apply. And just as a quick summary, really, for our listeners and certainly for our customer base, what would you say, just in a summary position, that they need to, what do they need to take away from this as the most important thing?
I mean, I think the most important thing is that you're clear that you aren't responsible for third-party service providers who might well be providing critical services, and just because you're providing support to that, you're not necessarily the critical service provider.
Mhm.
So I think that's the key point there.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
No worries, pleasure.
Thank you.
Speak soon.